Hi everyone, this is Raina. This video is for Gemini Sun, Moon, Venus, and Mars. And it is going to be 3 tips for Geminis to attract and keep love. And this is kind of fun for me because it looks at the traits that Gemini possesses and how it relates to your attitude towards love. Now, yes, I am referring to all of you as Geminis, even though some of you might have the moon in Gemini or Venus or Mars, but there's going to be some similar outcomes and attitudes when it comes to romantic relationships. And this is one of the reasons why you will read these things on, when you're looking at some kind of a source on astrology, and you will say, gosh, that sounds like my sun sign if you're Gemini sun sign, if you're reading the moon information or the Venus information. And there are going to be slight differences in terms of how the various planets function, in regards to love. And so they all have their own place, but you can look at these placements as all contributing to your influence when it comes to how you love. And it's not even how you participate in relationships, love relationships, but also your attitudes about love relationships, which differ from sign to sign. So, Gemini is a mutable air sign, and air signs tend to be detached. Now, many people will react to a statement like that and write to me and say, oh, I'm very emotional, blah, 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 and all that stuff. And we're talking about archetypes here. We're talking about templates. We're not talking about, your natal chart and all these different influences. Because, even the house that your Venus is in or your sun is in will influence on top of your Gemini sun or Gemini Venus. There are so many layers to the onion, and all of them will influence you to one degree or the other. But in terms of, in a general way, Gemini is a detached sign. It's also abstract because it is an air sign and is coming from that mental kind of a place. And love is the heart chakra. So the upper chakras are connected to the mind, to the immaterial. And therefore, sometimes when people are very intellectual, they have a lack of groundedness, just in the physical dimension, but also in terms of their relationships, there can be this disconnect. This is good to acknowledge within yourself if it resonates, because there can be misunderstandings in love, especially if you're with a water sign, for instance, where the other person doesn't feel, like you have that deep affection for them, simply because you have a different way, perhaps, of showing it. And this can lead to accusations sometimes, and then there are hard feelings. So it's really important to examine how we approach love and whether or not we are kind of sending out mixed messages or even a very false message altogether about what we feel regarding love. It's not that Geminis are incapable of love, but simply that the way that you perceive it and the way that you demonstrate it may just be different. So I want to talk about these tips. And the first one I have here is be consistent. be willing to put time and energy into one person. Now, obviously, I'm coming from a monogamous point of view, and not everybody is into that. And of course, if you're not into that, then you can just substitute one person for two people if you're like interested in a polyamorous situation. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because I realize that not everybody wants the same thing. So the point is that if you want a quality relationship and you want a permanent relationship, you have to invest time into it. And this requires consistency in spending time with one person. The reason I'm emphasizing consistency is because your sign of Gemini can be quite interested in variety. Being a mutable sign, there is this love of change, and mutable, but also ruled by Mercury. So it's like a double change agent type of a sign where you just love new things. And this is how you are wired. Okay, again, this is going to kind of be a little bit different depending on what your placement is. For instance, if your sun is there, this could maybe be more of like your career goals, that you are very flexible. You want to have two accomplished careers, but they might be in totally diverse areas. Okay, something like that, where you're aspiring to become something and it is connected to, career matters. But with the moon, it's your emotional nature. So being consistent for somebody with the moon in Gemini might look like being on more of an even keel emotionally, so that you're not too fickle in romance. Because I could totally see somebody who has the moon in Gemini who gets bored very easily with a partner and just wants to go to the next thing. And a person like that doesn't value putting time into one thing or consistency, because they see it almost as an oppressive thing. And this is problematic. This is what has to kind of be looked at and altered, so that they say, like with some people, jack of all trades and master of none. Somebody that just has their hand in a bunch of different pies, and they're trying to experiment or try out certain areas of life, or maybe one area of life, but multiple examples of it. So even like a person who is interested in a specific area, like a career, but they don't master that area, and they just bounce around from one thing to the other and wonder why they can't master that particular type of career. But they never stick with it, and they go to something else, and then maybe they come back to the original thing. And it has to be like that you invest your energy into a person, even if it feels difficult or somehow strange. And I think about sometimes how Gemini does this, and I wonder if a lot of this is about the fear of commitment, wanting to kind of have that sense of freedom. But it's interesting about freedom. Freedom is a funny thing, because eventually, as some of these people get older, they may find that they have not invested in anything, and they are still running, and they are still dodging, and then they wind up with kind of a shallow existence because they were only skimming the surface of life. So there's really something going on beneath the surface when it comes to this behavior that may be motivating people to kind of, bail out of a relationship once it becomes more familiar, once it becomes more predictable, when sometimes we have to kind of tolerate discomfort in order to get to the good stuff. Okay, so number 2 is observe your feelings, attitudes in relationship and adjust your behavior. Analyze yourself for a change. I don't know if you can tell that I typed these out ahead of time. Okay, so these 3 tips, I mean, I could have made more, but I wanted to stick to just a few. But when I say observe your feelings and attitudes in relationship and adjust your behavior and analyze yourself for a change, I'm talking about the fact that air signs can be very analytical about life, about their relationships, and they may have amazing insights, but feelings have to have a place here, and you have to kind of like see your emotional reactions to when you are with somebody, and see if perhaps something is being triggered within you that then leads you to kind of abandon the relationship down the line or never really give of yourself at a deep level. And I had made this observation to another, in another recording for this series, and I said, it isn't always the case that people can't find partners. Sometimes people don't have a problem attracting a potential partner, but keeping that relationship alive can be where it runs into difficulty. And so that's why I said attract and keep love, because it's not just about attracting it into your life. And one thing that you have to do, especially if you have a pattern where you feel like you'll meet somebody and everything seems like it's great, and then all of a sudden the other person calls it off, or all of a sudden you decide that it's not the right relationship. Observe what, especially with the latter, what is going through your mind when you feel that way? Are you somebody who is afraid of intimacy? Are you the kind of person who gets upset when the other person is kind of like expecting you to become more forthcoming about yourself, and you feel, for whatever reason, very uncomfortable with divulging more about your past or things of that nature? Because if you have the moon in Gemini, let's say you're a sun the moon in Scorpio, for instance, and your sun is in Gemini, that could be the perfect example where you may learn everybody else's life story, but when somebody's trying to learn about you, you're all of a sudden your mom. And it's funny because I had this experience the other day, and I was thinking about it later, where this woman, I was waiting for a train, and this woman was asking me about my bicycle and how do I, transport it, where was I coming from? She was asking these questions, and I was very open with her. And then I just said something like, oh, are you going to, and then all of a sudden she was like closed-mouthed, and she just said something very quickly, and she walked to the other end of the platform, and I was like, oh, okay. Was it something I said? And then I thought about it later, and I thought, yeah, maybe she's a Scorpio, and she doesn't mind asking other people questions, but it's not a two-way street. Actually, if you have a moon sign in water, Gemini, you may have a particular confusion about how your feelings are impacting your relationship. You may veer back and forth between wanting that kind of emotional connection and fearing it. So it can lead to blowing hot and cold, and that can create a lot of confusion for the other party where they're just not understanding where you're coming from. So observe your own feelings and do it in a very kind of like a non-judgmental and detached point of view where you're not trying to accuse yourself of anything and loving yourself in that process, but really kind of uncovering what is truly going on within you. And the third thing I wrote, which I think is true for all of us, is listen more and talk less. Gemini tends to be quite a talker. And I would say too that, look for people who are willing to talk. If you're in a relationship with somebody who is quiet and they are, maybe that's a good match for you, even though you're completely different, like a complementary type of personality. But I would think that for a lot of you, that would be a deal breaker. Somebody who is the strong silent type, but they're silent. So being able to really value the fact that this is a major thing with you, that you are a communicator, but that you don't always have to communicate is key. Listening to others means that you care what they have to say. It means that you're not just interested in hearing yourself talk. And I think everyone has had the experience of being in a conversation that's one-sided. And it's very frustrating. It really feels like the other person is just using you to hear themselves talk. And in a relationship, I'm sure that it would feel very lonely and disrespectful to be the one that is always having to listen to the other person. I'm talking about if you're the one who's always talking, the other person may feel disrespected, as if you don't really care about their point of view, and it could be a one-sided relationship. Also, when you listen, you're gaining insight into how the other person is thinking, and that makes it more informative for you, because then you can gauge whether or not the two of you have the potential for a lifetime together. But especially in the initial stages, when you're first meeting someone, you may be surprised that the other person does find it so offensive. I'm sure there are some people, not just Geminis, by the way, who go on a date and unwittingly turn that other person off because they're just completely rambling on about themselves. And they may not even be particularly self-absorbed, just not self-aware. When I say self-absorbed, they may, in fact, care about others besides themselves, but they have a lack of self-awareness, so it's very hard for them to see or understand how they are coming across to the other party. And this can lead to somebody who ends up turning someone off, and it might have been a great matchup. There's a sense of humility when we don't always feel like we have to give our opinions and dominate the conversation. It's a passive act to listen. And like I said, it's not just about Geminis. There are a lot of people that need to hear that. Okay, that's what I have for you, Gemini. I hope that you enjoyed this. And if you would like a private reading, I have love readings and natal chart interpretations, things like that. You can check me out at rainandmoonastrology.com, and the link to my online store is below. Take care. Bye.